There are currently 170 League of Legends champions in Arena, and I have played every single one of them. If I were to spend a minute talking about each one, this video would be about 3 hours long. In order to prevent that and make this video more manageable for everyone, I'll be breaking up the champions into the categories that League has set up for Arena. Today, we'll be talking about fighters, which is a bit of a weird class because you'd assume that these would be the champions who dominate a game mode where all you do is fight, but there's something very important to remember. A lot of champions in this class are top laners, who are balanced around the fact that they will be higher level or have more resources than certain champions like ADCs, for example, and without this advantage, they can seem a bit weak. They also oftentimes really utilize runes like Conqueror, Phase Rush, or Fleet very effectively, and not being able to have them can hurt. Now, a little disclaimer before we get into our first champion, the fighters are going to be quite difficult to rate because they are all kind of around the same level. Well, some are definitely better than others, but I do think you could win on any single one of these champions, especially if you are pretty good at the champion. I think the fighter class can really benefit based on just how good you are on the champion. So the way I'm kind of doing my tier list is that on average, how well do I think this champion is going to play? So the way I'm doing this tier list is, on average, how successful do I expect this champion to be in most games? And again, if you're popping off on a champion that I'm putting pretty low, then hats off to you. I'm super happy for you, but just on average, I don't see that champion doing too well. We'll also, of course, have to look at all of the buffs and nerfs that come with each champion, as Arena has a bunch of that. And the first champion we have is Aatrox, whose healing has been increased, and the AD on his ultimate has been increased. And I think he is a pretty solid champion. He could be in the strong but kiteable tier, but on average, he does have decent mobility, has decent speed, he has good CC, and I think he is just a solid pick. He's not going to get any higher because he can still be kited at the end of the day. He doesn't have the most range, and you could end up just like missing your Qs. And he is one of those champions that the better you are at Aatrox, the better he will be, because he does take a little bit of skill to really play well. I think the fact that he has just so much natural Omnivamp forcing the enemies to go anti-heal is really nice for Aatrox, because healing is just really powerful in this game mode. Because, again, there's only 2 people who are able to hit you instead of the normal 5 people who can hit you, so having a lot of Omnivamp or just healing in general is very, very powerful, which is why Aatrox is a solid choice. Now we have Mbessa, who doesn't have any changes, I believe, in Arena yet, and I actually first timed her in Arena, and I absolutely popped off on her. I had to get really lucky with my augment choices, getting like Jeweled Gauntlet and just some mobility augments. But this champion just has so much mobility. She has a really good ultimate, kind of similar to Vi, where it is a skill shot, but you can just immediately jump onto them. She's very sticky in a way where she constantly has these dashes to keep up with people. She has pretty good damage. She has pretty good Omnivamp. She can feel a bit weaker in the early game, but as she gets more items, she does feel very strong. She is a solid choice. She can be outplayed though if you are able to keep your distance, if you are able to use range to shut her down, which is why she's not going any higher. Next up we have Velveth, which has actually been buffed. She gets more lifesteal, she gets more on-hit damage, and on-hit effects are just really, really powerful. And because Velveth has her E where she can proc on-hits a bunch of times, and there's so many augments that are good with on-hits, there's so many items that are good with on-hits, Velveth is definitely OP. She's kind of similar to Aatrox, where she has pretty good mobility, she has the knock-up, which is nice, but unlike Aatrox, she can actually build on hit and be very successful with it, which is why I'm going to put her in the OP tier. There are some games where she can feel lackluster if you aren't hitting the augments that buff your on hits, but because there's just so many that do that, it's why I'm going to put her in OP tier, because it's not that unlikely you're going to have a gameplay that can revolve around having very powerful on hits. And unlike most champions who are really good with on hits, she actually is buffed instead of nerfed, which is kind of ridiculous and why I think she is, spoilers, probably the most OP fighter at the moment, because she can just exploit the system. Briar is a champion that I always expect to do really, really well and to pop off, but she kind of feels lackluster, and the reason for that is pretty much her entire kit is super duper nerfed, which is why she's going in the OP but super nerfed category. If she didn't have these nerfs, she would probably just be straight up OP, because again, having lifesteal is very powerful. She has a point and click CC ability, which still makes her pretty decent, but she can feel kind of lackluster unless you're hitting these like augments or items that make her very powerful. If you just have like a standard game going on, Briar can feel kind of weak just because she has been nerfed so many times, which is why she belongs in this tier. Now, don't get me wrong, any champion in the OP but super nerf tier could easily still be OP if you hit really good augments. It's just that you're now more required to hit those breakpoints in order for them to actually shine, and if you're not, the champion can feel actually pretty pathetic sometimes, which is rather sad. Camille's kind of a strange champion to rate, because she does deal a ton of damage in League of Legends, but to me, honestly, she kind of feels more like a champion that when she's level 18 before anybody else, she can really one-shot people, and she kind of plays like this assassin almost, just jumping onto the carry and blowing them up. But in Arena, it's more rare for that actually to happen with Camille, and she kind of has like this setup style where she wants to Q1 and then wait a little bit and Q2, but in Arena, the game is so fast-paced, especially in the late game, that it can be a bit difficult to get that. Don't get me wrong, like all fighters are, she can be very strong, but I'm gonna put her in the strong but kiteable tier. If you're good at Camille, by all means play her, but if you're just like an average Camille, I think you'll find her to be rather lackluster. Her builds also aren't that exciting because on hit is just more powerful than something like Triforce. You kind of are a champion that is bursty, but there's also a lot of times just people who are too tanky, even for a Camille, which does sound absolutely ridiculous. She does have % health damage on her kit, I believe, but it's not consistent enough for me to rate her higher. Darius is a champion that when I think Arena, I think, oh boy, I can't wait to play Darius. He sounds like he'd be so fun. He's like a super awesome brawler. But in all honesty, I actually think he's kind of bad. And on top of that, he's nerfed. See, Darius is really good because in lane, he bullies you, and then with that, he is able to get this big advantage throughout the game, usually by having more levels, having more gold. But because Darius will be on an even playing field because of the way Arena works, where everybody is the same level, everybody has relatively the same items, he kind of feels lackluster, and I'm going to end up putting him in the awful late category, because late game, he is absolutely terrible. He just gets kited. It's really hard for him to get his max passive stacks, and even when he does, it isn't oftentimes enough to actually blow up like the super duper tanky people, which is a big surprise because you think Darius would be good against tanks, as he normally is with his natural armor pen and stuff like that. But people who are just building straight health can kind of end up ignoring Darius. And there's just so many items themselves that do like more damage than Darius does. Like a tank with Sunfire who has Heartsteel stacks actually will just kind of end up beating the Darius, which feels really, really weird. I think he is decent early on, but even then he can just be kind of kited if you like play well, because all he has is his apprehend, and you don't have to like risk going for minions, where is when he would like apprehend you normally. So, and a flash apprehend isn't like that wonderful. He can't even W as often in like normal League of Legends because its cooldown has been increased. Honestly, I think they should get rid of the nerfs to Darius, just because I believe he feels kind of bad. As long as the players get better and better and you're like able to kite him, I think that he does feel rather lackluster. And yes, Darius fans, I agree, he is still really fun to play, but I genuinely believe he does feel kind of lackluster. Diana, kind of similarly to Darius, is a bit weird because she's normally a jungler in League of Legends, and she's like one of the fastest clearing jungles, so she usually has this really big lead over her opponents, and that enables her to shine throughout the game. But in Arena, she is like at an even playing field. She does have a bunch of buffs, and she definitely needs it. But despite that, I'm still going to put her in the meh category. Of course, if you hit really, really good augments for her, she's going to absolutely shine. But like, who does that not apply to? If my Diana rolls Jeweled Gauntlet because I had Transmute Gold, like, of course, I'm going to probably win the game, but is that really a sign of Diana being strong or the augment being strong? When you play Diana, she's probably best almost like as a setup champion for your teammate. Just because everybody's more tanky in Arena, she doesn't feel that amazing to build as an AP burst champion, and I just think there are better setup champions in the game than Diana. I believe Fiora's nickname is like the Grand Duelist, so you would assume she'd be really good in the fighting game mode, and she is, which is why she is pretty nerfed in this mode. She just has less % max health damage, she has less AD ratio and everything. Her W has a super duper long cooldown, which makes it harder for her to outplay opponents. She's kind of awkward where she is kind of squishy where she can get absolutely popped, and because she's nerfed, she doesn't do the same amounts of damage. I think Fiora is going to be better the better of a Fiora player she is. You have to like really know your limits. And I just think that because of all of her nerfs, she ends up being in the OP but super nerfed category, similarly to Briar. She can do well, but she will feel a lot weaker than you expect. And that's simply because she is nerfed like 4 times, which is a pretty big amount. GP as a champion isn't changed too much. What he gets is 7% of gold, I believe, from your Q. And I'm going to put him in the skill-based can be OP tier. If you're a really good GP player, you can absolutely pop off with this champion, especially because there are so many different crit augments, and GP loves having crit. I think that for most people, GP could be kind of hard because you do have to play around your barrels really well. If the enemy pops your barrel, he feels really bad. He can be a bit squishy against like long range champions. The game is kind of like fast paced where you could like choke using your barrels. So pretty much GP, the better you are at him, the better he's going to feel in arena. So the people who are like one tricks at GP can shine. I still think they can sometimes struggle against people who have like too much range for the GP, but he is a champion that can just dish out so much damage with the right augments, with the right items, that he can be OP, but you do have to play him really, really well in order to feel OP. Garen is like Darius, but a big advantage of Garen is that his ultimate is less reliant on you hitting the enemy champion multiple times. You can kind of just like brain dead ult somebody when they're low, and oftentimes it'll be like from your teammates' damage. He is nerfed pretty heavily on 3 of his abilities, which is definitely needed because without him, he would easily be OP. That being said, I'm going to put him in the OP but super nerfed tier. You're either going to have a game with Garen where you feel absolutely amazing because you hit really good items, you hit really good augments, and that is going to happen more often than not, which is why he's going higher than these champions. But if you aren't hitting those conditions, he can feel a little lackluster. He can feel kind of lame. The fact that his W's damage reduction is only 20% does really hurt him, because he just feels a lot less tanky, and he can end up getting blown up if the enemies are hitting augments, which make them really powerful. He honestly just kind of plays like an assassin. If he is able to Q onto you and then E-spin on you, you are most likely dead when he ends up getting to ult, so he definitely has chances to still feel very OP. But if you are able to play around him, if you are able to like CC him enough that you can burst him, then his nerfs really do feel impactful and he can feel a bit weak in those instances. Gnar is a weird champion, and you can see that Riot Games agrees as they've given him so many buffs, but he's in this weird spot where in the competitive game of League of Legends, like the pro scene, Gnar is so OP that he always has to be kind of weak in normal League of Legends because otherwise pro players are going to really excel on him. And you can kind of feel that impact in Arena where he almost feels like a really good champion, but he just doesn't really hit the sweet spot. And in my opinion, the buffs themselves don't help him get out of this awkward state. He's also a weird champion where he could be good with on hits if he stayed in his hyper form, but then he's going to transform into his rage form, where then your on hit build will feel a lot weaker. But then at the same time, you don't want to play only around your rage form because then you will feel a lot weaker while you're in the mini form. He's just a champion that you want to like play really well with your team with his like very powerful ultimate. He's like a good setup champion, kind of like Diana, but because he's like pretty conditional and feels pretty awkward, I'm actually going to end up putting him in the awful late category, because in the late game, before he like gets his rage bar all the way up, you can end up just getting popped if you're playing Gnar, which really, really sucks. Now, don't get me wrong, he definitely can have games where he's performing pretty well, but unless you're like a really good Gnar player, he does end up feeling a bit lackluster. Gragas is a champion when Arena first came out and he didn't have any changes. He was absolutely busted because he just kept CCing you forever. And they nerfed the E cooldown quite heavily to avoid that from happening. They also nerfed his healing on his passive because he just was an absolute tanky monster. They did increase the % maximum health damage on his W, which is pretty nice. He is going to end up being in the OP but super nerfed category, just because he is really nerfed on his E, where the cooldown is increased and the cooldown refund change being lowered so much does really, really hurt him. If you are able to get like some kind of CDR build where you can then constantly E people, Gragas does feel really, really nice. But overall, his damage just feels kind of lackluster, just because everybody's more tanky. The amount of burst he does feel a bit lackluster, and you really do feel the nerfs when you do play Gragas. That being said, with the right augments, he can definitely feel very powerful, like every champion on this list. Gwen is a champion that I didn't end up seeing any nerfs or buffs for, which surprises me, because I do think that she can be quite powerful. But I do think you need to have some comfortability when playing Gwen, so I'm going to put her in the skill-based can be OP tier. If you're really good with your W, if you're really good at like chasing people, she can feel pretty powerful. She does have a lot of like on-hit damage, which makes her rather nice. She can be surprisingly tanky with her W. She feels like she has a lot of natural sustain. She's really good against a lot of the other fighter champions on this list and can do a surprising amount of damage. She can struggle against range though, because once her W is down, she can get bursted. But as long as you play pretty slow, if you wait for like the zone, then Gwen can be an absolute menace. But you do have to play her kind of well for you not to just end up feeding and looking like a fool. Hecarim is kind of a weird champion to rate because I really do like playing him in Summoner's Rift. But in Arena, he can feel a bit lackluster, even though he has been buffed a bunch of times. I'm going to put him in the Met tier. I do think he has some combos, like for instance, Yuumi Hecarim is really, really annoying to deal with. I think my biggest problem with Hecarim, and actually a lot of fighters, is that their items just are a bit lackluster. Like an item like Triforce doesn't really hit the same as it does in Summoner's Rift. He's pretty decent with like Divine Sunderer, but at the same time, it's not really the same kind of like OP builds as other champions have. He's definitely not terrible, like Diana is not terrible. I think all the fighters are on average pretty decent. But when it comes to all the other fighters we've rated so far, he does feel a bit lackluster. Illaoi could easily be the most OP champion the way she works, because she just has so much natural healing, and she has like so much random AoE and just so much potential damage. Her E is like such a powerful spell in chunking the enemy if you and your teammate are able to hit the target. And she would easily be OP if she wasn't nerfed such a heavy amount. Like for instance, on her Q, the bonus tentacle damage has been changed at max rank from 30% to 20%, which is a 10% difference. And I think she's now strong, but very nerfed. If she didn't have these nerfs, she would definitely be OP. She might be the best fighter. And even though she has these nerfs, she still feels very strong and absolutely scary to fight if you are a melee champion. She can struggle, though, against, like, the long-range team comps, like mages are pretty good against Illaoi, or if you do end up missing her E, she can feel a bit lackluster. You could also, like, try to run away from her ultimate when she uses it. So there is now a bit of counterplay to Illaoi, but she is still a very terrifying champion, just because she still does have so much natural healing and damage. Irelia's buffs are kind of weird, where they really heavily buffed her AP damage, and maybe a full AP Irelia build would actually be good. It's not something I've seen, it's not something I've tried. I'm kind of doubtful because everybody's just more naturally tanky, so having like AP burst in general feels a bit weaker. That being said, I'm still going to put her in the skill-based can be OP tier, and that's because I think she's sneakily really good with on-hit builds, just because of like her passive giving her a bunch of on-hit benefits. She's really good with like scopier weapons, for instance. I think she's one of the best users because she does kind of struggle as a melee champion to stick on people and to constantly auto-attack them. But if you're able to hit them from afar, she can do a surprising amount of damage, so that if you are really good at Irelia, she can feel pretty decent. She's also more tanky thanks to her buffs, where she doesn't get blown up as much. She's also not as easy to kite as some other champions because she does have a point and click on her Q. But if that goes on cooldown, she can kind of struggle, and she can also struggle against a lot of CC. Like Irelia, Jarvan's buff comes to his AP damage on his E, where it's been increased to 100% AP. That being said, I definitely do not recommend going an AP Jarvan build. I don't see that working out. I'm going to put Jarvan in the solid tier, mostly because he's really good at setting up his teammate for having like a wombo combo. Like, for instance, Fiddlesticks would really like playing with a Jarvan, Rumble would really like it, MF would really like it, Kennen, just champions that have like this wombo combo desire. Jarvan is one of the best champions. The reason why he's not going higher on this tier list is because Flash exists, so if you can flash out of his ultimate, it kind of sucks to play Jarvan. That being said, he still has health % damage on his passive, which is pretty good in Arena. He can build like full lethality. He can go a tankier build. He just has a lot of versatility, which is quite nice in Arena. So you can play around what augments you get. But he definitely doesn't feel the strongest. He just feels like a solid choice, and you do need your teammate to be pretty strong to make Jarvan work. Jax was probably like a top 10 champion before he received all of his nerfs, and he's received a lot of them. And for those reasons, he's going straight into OP, but super nerfed. He's received pretty decent nerfs to his damage, but more importantly, he's received nerfs to his survivability, which does make him feel a bit squishier, so you can get blown up on Jax. That being said, there are so many good on-hit augments, like I've been repeating, and Jax is one of the best users for them. But if he's not able to hit targets many times, then he can feel a bit weak. But as long as you are able to somehow survive the early burst of enemy champion, there are few fighters that feel as great as Jax in an elongated fight. So as long as you don't get burst down immediately, Jax will be an absolute menace. But you do need certain augments and items to get to that point. Now, Kayn is listed as a fighter because of Red Kayn, but when I made my Assassins tier list, I should have made an exception and put Blue Kayn on that list. And honestly, I've probably played at least 300 arena games, and I've played every single champion, but I don't know if I ended up playing Blue Kayn. And I've maybe seen like one or two the entire time I have played arena. That being said, he does have a pretty nice buff where his increased bonus damage can go up to 60% at level 18, which sounds absolutely amazing. That being said, I'm going to put him in the Squishies Reliant tier, because in his blue form, he just doesn't really do that much against tanks, and you can get like CC'd and just absolutely blown up pretty easily, I can imagine. That being said, I just haven't seen that many Blue Kayns, so I don't feel the most confident in my answer here. So if you do have a lot of experience with Blue Kayn, please let me know. But just because I haven't seen that many Blue Kayns, I don't think he is the best. Now, when Arena first came out, Red Kayn was the best champion in the entire game by far, because he just had so much % health damage. It was absolutely ridiculous. If you built like Axiom Arc on him, his ultimate would pretty much one-shot you. And so what they had to do was nerf him so many times. I still think he can feel kind of decent, but Kayn has always felt a bit clunky to me, and now that he's been nerfed so many times, you can kind of actually outplay him without him just absolutely one-shotting you. I'm going to put him in the OP but super nerfed tier, because he is really heavily nerfed from when he first was available in Arena, which is absolutely necessary. But now if you kind of low roll your game, he can feel pretty bad on average, because he is just a lot weaker than he normally was. And before form, he does just feel really kind of awkward to play, where he doesn't do anything that special, which is why I'm going to put him in this tier. But man, before the nerfs, he was by far the best champion in Arena. Kled has one change, and it's super simple, and that's when he's revived, he now is revived on his mount. And Kled is kind of a weird champion, where he's really good in lane in League of Legends. He's like a pretty annoying lane bully, but if he's like even, he doesn't feel that amazing. He can potentially do like 1 billion damage, it feels like, with his ultimate, but the rest of his kit just kind of feels lackluster from when I've played him or when I've played against him. I'm gonna put him in the awful late category, because if you're able to survive the burst from his ultimate, he just doesn't do that much. He is kind of slow. When he gets knocked off his mount, he feels like really terrible. He just isn't a champion, and that can happen more often than not. So unless Kled is like really ahead, he just kind of feels bad from my experience. Lee Sin is one of my personal favorite champions to try to play effectively, and I'm kind of bad at Lee Sin, but he is buffed in all of his basic abilities, and it is quite nice. That being said, I'm going to put him in the skill-based can be OP category. His ultimate can just do a bunch of damage, especially if you're like able to kick the enemy into his ally. He can do a decent amount of burst. He has pretty good execution with his like Q doing more damage to low health targets. He can feel all right, but he definitely is rather skill reliant, because you have to like know your limits. You have to like kind of like fly in at the right times, and he can feel a bit lackluster, especially against like the on-hit abusing champions. Like all the fighters kind of can struggle against the champions who abuse on-hit, where like Lee Sin just has to like play perfectly, while a Bel'Veth just has to press E and like absolutely melt anybody that's near her. So for that reason, he is going to go near-ish the middle. If you're really good at Lee Sin, he can feel decent. You can have some good games, but if the enemies are high rolling, Lee Sin can feel a bit lackluster. Now, on hit is definitely really good, but what I think is king is just on hit damage in general. And even though Lilia's is nerfed, I mean, she still is so OP. It's only nerfed by 1%, and she's just constantly applying it. She's so fast where she's just like running at you, proccing it. She's proccing her Leandries, and then she's just like messing around, being so fast you can't even catch up to her. She's like super good with Phenomenal Evil. She has some really good mage items like Rune Carver, where she's just constantly stacking it. She's just like absolutely annoying to play if you're playing a champion that has any health stacking. Sure, she can kind of struggle against champions with a lot of burst, but she can like also build like something like Zanya's. She can even like consider maybe going a bit tankier just because like the percent health damage can carry her a long way. She's just absolutely annoying. I don't play against her that often because I ban her almost every game, so thankfully I don't have to see that champion that often. But when she's in the game and you don't have something to absolutely blow her up with, she is just a nightmare to face up against. Mordekaiser is an interesting champion because Arena is based around 2v2 gameplay, but Mordekaiser's like, nah, I'm actually just going to make it a 1v1. So it makes sense that he is nerfed, and he can be pretty powerful with the right augments. I just think that mage items in general are a bit lackluster on average, which is why I'm going to put him in the solid tier for now. He can also be like kited kind of easily. He does kind of struggle against range sometimes, but if you are able to ult somebody and get on top of them, Mordekaiser can feel very powerful. Honestly, I'm going to end up putting him in the strong but very nerfed tier because he is better than the solid champions on average, because I personally think I'm a terrible Mordekaiser player, but I have played him and done very well on him, which is definitely a sign that the champion is pretty good overall. If he wasn't nerfed, he definitely probably would still end up being an OP tier, but because of the nerf, it does make it that you can outplay him if you are able to juke his E pretty much. Nasus is a pretty simple League of Legends champion, and the only buff he has is that he gets 45 stacks automatically for his Q, and I'm going to put him in the strong but kiteable tier. I think his W is a very, very powerful ability in Arena where you just absolutely shut down the movement speed and attack speed of one enemy champion. That being said, he is super duper easy to kite because he doesn't have any hard CC. The enemy has like flash or their own CC. It can be hard for the Nasus to catch up to somebody. He isn't like the biggest Giga tank where if you do have enough burst, you can shut him down. If the game is like only silver or gold augments, I do think Nasus is actually quite good. But if there are like high rolling prismatic augments or like really strong gold augments that enemies have, I think Nasus can really struggle, which happens more often than not when you're playing Arena. For some reason, Nilah is listed as a fighter, but I guess if you kind of think about it, it makes sense. Like, she does belong as a marksman in the bot lane in League of Legends, but she is kind of like a Yasuo or a Yone, where she is, in theory, like a melee champion, so she hits somebody with Q. She doesn't have any buffs or nerfs, what I see, and I'm going to put her in the skill-based can-be OP tier. She's really strong with, like, crit builds, which are pretty easy to come by in Arena. She can struggle against a lot of CC, but she is a good counter to a lot of like other ADCs if she can get on top of them, because she does have the Jax effect where she can become immune to auto attacks, and she can absolutely burst people with the right builds. It's just that you do have to know your limits, and you do have to play around poke and CC in order to make Nilah play effectively, because otherwise you are just going to get blown up. Nocturne's another champion that I didn't see any changes for, and he is an interesting one where he does feel pretty decent with on-hit builds. The only thing that sucks for him is that he is like a true melee champion, that if the enemies flash very effectively, he can feel lackluster. He can feel very squishy if you go for on-hit builds. He doesn't really do well with like normal builds. So he's in this awkward state where I'm going to put him in the met tier. I just think like there's not that many augments that he really, really loves. I mean, he does like the on-hit ones, but then again, he does feel pretty squishy for a melee champion that wants to be in their face, that you can potentially like absolutely blow somebody up, but if you have to deal with like enough CC and peel, he will feel kind of awkward and pretty weak. So Nocturne definitely does have potential in games, but at the same time, he can feel kind of sucky to play as because he does feel quite squishy against a lot of people. Olaf's another champion that doesn't have any buffs or nerfs listed, and he's kind of hard for me to rate. I'm going to put him in the strong but kiteable tier. He's really good against teams that are just like tank based, that really want to rely on their CC, because he can kind of keep his ult on forever, especially if like you wait until the zone, until you really start fighting, because then the enemies can't run away from you. That being said, he can feel sometimes a bit squishy, where he can get absolutely blown up by champions with a lot of on-hit, or champions with just a lot of burst in general. So kind of similarly to Nasus, you want a game where the power level itself is kind of mediocre or not that amazing, because he doesn't really excel with any of the augments, making him like a super duper powerhouse, which is why I'm going to put him in the potentially strong category, but definitely like kiteable. Pantheon is a champion that has been buffed, and I'm actually going to put him in the OP tier. He's just really good with on-hit items, specifically Hellfire Hatchet and Bork. Like his Empowered W can just proc it so many times, and there's other on-hit items that just feel pretty strong on Pantheon. His E is really, really nice because you can stop a lot of burst coming in from you. I just see this champion do really, really well. He also has a point-and-click CC, which is really nice because Arena, you just want to outplay your opponents, but it's pretty hard to outplay a champion that just jumps on your head, procs a bunch of on-hits, and then tries to execute you with his Q. And when his teammate is also hitting you at the exact same time, oftentimes there isn't that much counterplay, surprisingly, when you're facing up against a Pantheon, where even though it kind of surprises me, I always see this champion do pretty well, which is why I'm going to put him in the OP tier. Rek'Sai is a champion that has a bunch of buffs, and she has a lot of increases to her AP. That being said, that's not going to save her from being in the awful late game category. I think Rek'Sai in general just kind of feels bad to play as, even like in Summoner's Rift. I think a lot of people just don't really enjoy this champion at the moment. She doesn't do enough consistent damage. She doesn't do enough burst, where she just kind of feels awkward. She's not that tanky. She's just kind of mediocre in every single category, which is pretty bad. In Arena, you kind of want to just really shine in one category and like play around that, or be like pretty decent in every category, while Rek'Sai doesn't really do either. So I'm going to end up putting her in this category. Renekton has one nerf where his W cooldown has been increased, which is fair because a point-and-click CC is really powerful in Arena. And that's why he's not going to the strong but kiteable tier. Instead, he's going to go in the solid tier, because that point-and-click CC is pretty nice to have. He also uses on-hit items actually kind of well, but similarly to a lot of champions that belong in the solid tier, if the game is like a really high roll one, he can feel a bit weaker sometimes. His ultimate is pretty nice though, as it does give him just a bunch of bonus stats. It does give him some percent health damage, which is also kind of nice. So Renekton does feel pretty nice to play. He is pretty flash reliant though, so if you don't have flash, you will feel a lot weaker. Your gameplay does kind of revolve around you flashing on top of people with his W, but then he does also have some dashes in emergency with his E, so overall a solid choice. Riven is a champion that I don't see any nerfs or buffs to, and when Rina had a ranked mode, the guy who was in first, I forgot his name, my apologies. He's a pretty good guy, but he was a Riven one trick, and he was just absolutely doing well with her. And Riven is a pretty amazing champion because you can play her as an assassin, especially with like Axiom Arc, where you go in and just absolutely blow somebody up. That being said, Riven, you have to be really good at Riven in order to play her well. That person was a Riven one trick, and if you're just like an average Riven player, you're not going to have the same success with her. I do think this champion is sneakily very, very strong. You can build her full glass cannon. You can build her more bruisery if you need. There are several augments which are pretty decent on her. One thing I think is a bit weird is that like her interaction with power flowers and her ultimate can be a bit awkward, where like you don't get the cooldown on it. But if you are able to play her well and just blow somebody up, I think that Riven can be one of the best champions. That being said, you do have to play Riven really, really well, and you can still get like kited or burst if the enemy champions are playing well. Rumble, kind of similarly to Gnar, struggles from him being too strong in pro play, where he just has a bunch of nerfs. So nowadays, I think he is in the strong but kiteable tier. Before all the nerfs, he definitely was higher on this tier list, but he's just getting weaker and weaker in general. His ultimate is really good in team fights, but it does kind of rely on setup. So if your teammate doesn't have that much setup, Rumble ult can feel a bit lackluster. He can potentially do a bunch of damage with the right augments, but if he doesn't hit those augments, I do think AP champions in general feel a bit weaker. Because he doesn't have that much range, he can sometimes just straight up lose those fights against people who are hitting him, because they will just like out-sustain the damage he's pumping out. Set seems to be the poster child for Arena, but he does really struggle from not having something like Conqueror or Phase Rush or Grasp. And he's going to end up being in the strong but kiteable tier. The way you play Set is kind of just revolving around one-shotting people with your W. And if they are able to avoid it, then he does feel a lot weaker. His ultimate does do a lot of damage because everybody has a bunch of HP. But if the enemies have enough range, if they are able to like flash your W, if they flash your E, he can feel a bit lackluster. He can kind of just get melted by the champions who have a bunch of on hit. That being said, Set can be very rewarding if you do get that beautiful W off that just absolutely melts people. But in the cases you don't get that, he kind of feels bad. Shyvana is a champion that has nerfs to her Q and E. The biggest one is the on-hit damage after you hit E has been reduced, which is pretty impactful, as doing % max health damage is the best stat in Arena. That being said, it looks like her W fireball damage has an AD ratio, which is increased. It's kind of hard to tell with looking at all the stat adjustments, but I believe that's the case. I'm going to put her in the solid tier. She does have some augments that are really good on her. Like, I think she's one of the best vulnerability users. I think she's one of the best, like, ethereal weapons or vulnerability users thanks to her W, because I think it works on both of those. So she can constantly be proccing her Bork damage. She's a champion that's really good with like hybrid damage, so anything that gives her both of those, she's pretty good on. She can use on hit pretty effectively, which does make me think she is quite decent. But I do think the champions above her are just a little bit more special. That's why she's going in the solid tier. Man, Trundle before the nerfs was an absolute nightmare. And man, thankfully he has those nerfs, but even though he has them, he's still so strong. He is so easy to play too, where you just press Q on people, you just constantly heal with your W, you just press R on somebody and absolutely melt them. Not as much before the nerfs. Before the nerfs, it was just like no chance of you beating Trundle. He's just so good with on hits. He's pretty naturally tanky. He steals your AD. He makes you weaker. He constantly slows you. He's super sticky. He can be bursted if you have like a really good game. Like, he is one of those champions that doesn't like a super high roll prismatic game. Just in general, he can feel pretty oppressive just whacking you with his club, that you do have to kind of have a good situation, otherwise you will just lose to Trundle. Tryndamere has a bunch of buffs to his Q, but the most interesting buff is to his W, where the attack damage reduction can go all the way up to 120 at max rank, which is pretty crazy. Now, I'm going to put him at the top of the solid tier list, and it's not because of the attack damage reduction, even though that is pretty amazing. I'm going to give it to him because he's so good with on-hit effects, because he can constantly just hit people a bunch of times, where it can prevent him from getting one-shot, which is very strong. If he doesn't hit those on-hit augments, though, he can feel a bit lackluster, because you can kind of end up like kiting him enough with enough CC. He doesn't do that much damage without the right items and augments, because he himself doesn't have any % health damage, so he does need the right items in order to be strong. And those items, like Bork, have been nerfed a little bit. If they weren't, he would be much higher on this list. He could also struggle against range, because he doesn't have any hard CC, that if the enemies are able to flash and kite against him, he can feel a bit lackluster. But more often than not, Tryndamere feels like a solid pick. Udyr as a champion has had his Q pretty heavily nerfed, and they did reduce the AP ratio on his W on hit heal, but they did increase the shield he gets, and they did also increase the AP damage on his ultimate. I think Udyr is a pretty solid choice. He has a lot of augments that he can use pretty effectively, because when you load into the game, you haven't decided yet if you want to go for like a pure on-hit build. You haven't decided if you want to go for an AP build. He can even go for like a more tanky build, because he does provide utility with his stun. I think overall he is just a very solid champion. There are some games where you can get really high highs, so he is one of those champions that can have like a really amazing augment game, which is really nice for Udyr. He can struggle though if you like go for an on-hit build and you are a bit squishy. He is pretty like flash reliant, so he isn't going to go any higher on this list, but he does feel relatively solid, especially because he can have CC immunity with his E, helping him get in there. The way they nerfed Urgot is interesting, where they didn't nerf like his abilities like most champions. They just nerfed his base stats. And I'm going to put him in the solid tier. He does use some augments pretty well, but he is rather short range, and he doesn't have the best mobility, that he can really struggle against long range team comps. He can also get like blown up by a lot of ADCs from my experience. And even against like certain tanks, he doesn't have the most % health damage, where it can take him a while to get those kills. He's one of those champions that are best in games that have like a pretty average strength level, because when I see Urgot, he doesn't do well in those like super high roll games on average. Vi is an interesting champion because she has one of the best single target lock on abilities in her ultimate, And the way they wanted to address that is by just nerfing the damage a ton, so going like full lethality Vi doesn't feel as good. They did buff her Q late game though, where the cooldown on it is actually reduced at max rank. It is nerfed early on, and they did increase the damage, I believe. That being said, one of the best things about Vi is her W, giving her percent health damage as well as armor shred. So I'm going to put her in the strong but very nerfed tier because the nerf on her ultimate is quite significant, but definitely necessary. Her W still being so powerful, her still being able to CC you a bunch of times. She has some really good augments, like Mystic Punch, for instance, is one of the best augments for all fighters that we have listed here, and Vi especially is one of the best because it allows her to constantly be Qing and Eing you. She's naturally tanky with her passive shield. She just feels like an all-around decent champion. She just doesn't belong in the OP tier because she isn't able to fully one-shot people now that her ultimate almost does like half the damage it used to. Viego is a champion I just can't believe isn't nerfed, as he's just like so strong with on-hit builds. He can do so much damage with his ultimate, as it does more damage the lower the enemies are. He has a lot of like natural attack speed with his E. He's definitely going to go in the OP tier, and it definitely feels like a champion that Riot kind of just forgot about. Like when you used to be able to see the arena ladder, you would just see that like Viego was in every single top team comp because he's just one of the best champions at using on hit, and he just isn't nerfed like most of the other ones are. He can struggle against like really good poke or disengaged comps, but even then he can like absolutely just melt tanks sometimes with his own natural Bork passive, and then he can go Bork as well. And he just is an absolute menace, and I am genuinely shocked he hasn't been nerfed yet. Speaking of nerfs, Volibear has like all of them, but they are super duper needed. The nerf on his Q is like insane actually, with the bonus AD ratio being reduced so much. They also just reduce all of his shielding, all of his healing. Doesn't matter, Volibear is still a very strong champion in Arena. You definitely can feel the nerfs where he isn't OP anymore, but having a point-and-click CC ability is very good. Having natural healing is super duper strong. Having a bunch of percent scaling with your own health and having a bunch of scaling with the enemy's health is just the best stats you can have in Arena because everybody just has more health in general, which is why Volibear is a super duper strong pick. Even if he is omega nerfed, he can still really, really shine. Another champion that is heavily nerfed is Warwick. But unlike Volibear, he doesn't have a point-and-click CC, and he doesn't have scaling based on his own percent health, so he is going in the OP but super nerf tier. He also feels a lot more susceptible to like anti-heal, while Volibear still has natural shielding, which is a bit more annoying to deal with. Warwick's damage in general just also feels a bit lackluster. He can struggle with being kited. His E cooldown's a lot longer, we're not getting it that often. He used to be one of my favorite champions to play, but I do think they nerfed him pretty heavily where he can feel awkward unless you're like having a very good game for him. He's definitely going to still feel pretty strong in the early game, but as the game goes longer and longer, he's not going to be able to get the targets low enough for him to actually pop off a lot of the times. So in those cases, he just feels weaker. Another champion that has a lot of nerfs is Wukong, which actually kind of surprised me as he didn't feel that oppressive ever from my experience, but they just nerfed his Q damage, they made his W longer, and they also nerfed the max health damage on his ultimate. I'm gonna put him, I guess, in the OP but super nerfed category, because I guess if he didn't have these nerfs, he would just simply be OP, but it's been a long time since I've seen a Wukong do really well. Maybe he belongs actually in a lower category because he has these nerfs. So yeah, I'm actually gonna end up putting him in the meh tier, because he does feel pretty meh. Like, he's decent if you have like setup where you want to be Wukong ulting somebody, knocking them up, as the knockup can't be affected by tenacity, which is pretty nice, and then maybe you have something on top of the Wukong ult to shut them down. But I think he is quite conditional in order for him to feel strong, and with the nerfs I just think he feels a bit lackluster. Xin Xhao has 2 buffs which makes AP scaling better on him, and it doesn't really matter that much because there's not that many instances where you're building AP Xin Xhao. That being said, I'm going to put him in the solid tier because he is pretty good with on-hit items. He also can do better against the long-range team comps because of his ultimate, making him immune to damage outside of the little ult zone, which is rather nice. It can take him a while to kill really tanky champions, and he can still get bursted down by others because he isn't the tankiest himself. but there are several items that like increase his dash cooldown or just cooldowns in general if you use a lot of abilities, and Xin Zhao is able to use a bunch of abilities really quickly. So there are some situations where he will feel a lot more powerful, but there will also be situations where he just gets blown up once his ultimate is off cooldown. Next up, we have the Wind Brothers, which are kind of hard to rate because sometimes they can feel very, very strong if they get the right crit augments, and other times a team with Yasuo Yone will just like FF and be 8th place and you won't even remember that they were in the lobby. So I'm going to put him in the meh tier. Yasuo only gets buffs to his E, which like, who cares? In a way, his like shield is better. There will be some games where the Yasuo player will do really well because he has like perfect crit augments, has perfect crit items. But in other cases, he just won't have enough of his wind knockups because there are no minions to be hitting. He's pretty good if like his teammate is able to knock them up so he can then ult and get in the fight. But if you have like enough CC to shut him down, he can feel kind of meh. He's like a good example of a champion that will like oftentimes either get 2nd or 3rd or like 8th or 7th. He's like kind of in that range because if he's high rolling, he will feel strong. If he's not, he will feel terrible. Now, Yone is less reliant on his teammate because he doesn't need them to be knocking them up in order to have his own knockup effect. So I'm going to put him higher, and he does have like better buffs in general. But similarly to Yasuo, I think he struggles where he doesn't have the minions to be hitting. So if the enemies have a bunch of range, it can be really annoying. I think Yasuo's Wind Wall is actually a really powerful ability in Arena because you can shut down like powerful skill shots while Yone will just end up getting hit by them, and he can get poked down a lot more easily. So he's also going to go in the meh tier. Similarly to Yasuo, he can have games where he really pops off, but more often than not, he can just kind of struggle. The final fighter, we have Yorick, who has a passive effect which allows him to get ghouls more easily, which is super duper nice. That being said, the ghouls are squishier, and his maiden is also squishier, and he also gets less health from his Q. I think he is still pretty strong. He can be really annoying to fight against because he just has this W, which puts you in these awkward situations. He can do a bunch of damage to you while not even being near you. And then once you are near him, he will just like bonk you with a shovel and constantly heal. So he is just kind of like an awkward champion to fight, and he can just have like pretty good builds in general. He can also just like go like Leandries and try to melt. He's like weird builds in general that just like work really good on Yorick. So he's like this poke, tank, fighter champion, which is just awkward to deal with. And because he has all that nice versatility, he's going to belong in this category. Now that completes my fighter tier list for Arena. There's one champion that might be wondering where it is in Jace, but he's listed as a marksman for some reason, so I'll be talking about him in that video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave it a like. Feel free to let me know what you think about it in general in the comments below. Because again, this is just my opinion as somebody who has played all the champions, who has played a lot of Arena, and I'm definitely not going to be absolutely right about everything, as there are just so many champions to rate. Next up, though, we'll be rating all of the mage champions, so make sure to subscribe if you'd be interested in seeing that. Once again, thank you guys all so much for watching, and best of luck on your own Arena adventures. Jax was probably the champion